Hi everyone, this is Nomiki Konst. You are watching the Nomiki Show. Remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel just below the box. Or if you are not already, please join Patreon and become one of our patrons. It's patreon.com/the Nomiki Show. It's how we pay our bills. It's how we bring on staff. It's how this grows and we can do more reporting, more research, and present you guys with more tools to go out there and be amazing members of the movement. This week has been crazy. We launched the show a little over a week and a half ago, and the news has not stopped. It's supposed to be a weekly show, but of course, things have happened. And given that we're a show that deconstructs the establishment and wants to give you the tools to go out there and be the best people of the movement you could possibly be, we've had a busy week deconstructing, following the money, and I would be irresponsible to not do a segment on Michael Bloomberg at this point, which is why I went to my good friend, Zaid Jilani, who is a fellow at UC Berkeley. He's studying polarization, how appropriate right now, at UC Berkeley, but he was also previously a reporter at The Intercept, and I have gotten to know him through the years. He's been great at following the money and calling out corruption, frankly, to its face. So Zaid, thank you so much for joining the show. And for being someone who's been pretty open and frank about the tactics of the centrists when it's not always popular. And I think oftentimes you end up saying things that many of us are thinking or feeling, and you're able to put the pieces together. So you called out Bloomberg pretty early on. You smelled something was happening there, and I'll
Right.
credit you and your amazing reporting skills because you've developed this sixth sense for when shady stuff is happening. So tell us, to this point, where is Bloomberg in this process?
Yeah, so I want to rewind a few years to kind of explain my interactions with Michael, with the orbit of Michael Bloomberg. So when my first kind of job in DC was at Center for American Progress, a big kind of think tank, progressive type think tank, more allied to the Democratic establishment. And when I was there, I was working for the weblog Think Progress, which no longer exists, but basically it was like a center-left kind of news website. I was covering Occupy Wall Street. I wrote a story about how Michael Bloomberg's then girlfriend was on the board of Zuccotti Park, which is where Occupy Wall Street took place, and how she was pulling in something like six figures of income every year as Bloomberg was trying to clear this park of protesters.
Wait, hang on, real quick. Sorry, just so people know who are not New Yorkers, Zuccotti Park is in downtown Manhattan. Mayor Bloomberg was the mayor at the time, and he oversees the parks department. So that's very strange that his girlfriend was on the board of a park when he oversees it.
Exactly. It was a conflict of interest. I wasn't trying to say that, okay, everything he did about this park was because of his girlfriend, but your family members and loved ones are pulling in six figures overseeing this kind of management of this park, and the protesters are making the people who own the park upset. It was a sincere conflict of interest. So basically, I wrote a story about that. The head of the Center for American Progress then, she's still head of the Center for American Progress now, was Neera Tanden, who's also a former
Friend
Hillary
of the
Clinton
show.
aide. Exactly. She was very upset at me writing this article, and she said, "Hey, don't you know we're pitching him for money?" And I think that was the kind of dynamic you see with someone like Michael Bloomberg, is that he is one of the biggest political spenders, period. Although in the recent years, he's been more of a Democratic political spender, although he's also been a Republican Party political
So
spender,
that's
which I
what's
think we'll
weird about that,
probably
is
get
that
to.
at that time he was a Republican. He was not a registered Democrat. He had been an
Right.
independent as a mayor, I should say. But he had spoken at the Republican convention in 2004, and
Right.
Occupy Wall Street was only 5 years,
And
6 years
and
later.
get this, when he was up for his last reelection against a Democratic candidate, John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign chair, flew to New York City to endorse him against the Democrat. This side always talks about party loyalty, but against the Democrat. And I think part of this just is the reality that someone like Bloomberg has so much money that he can actually step outside the normal two-party dynamic in the United States to get the support of people because of the way he's able to throw it around. And this came up again in 2016 when he spoke at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention. I went around to many Democrats and I asked them, hey, this man was responsible for some really, kind of troubling stuff like spying on the Muslim population in New York City with his NYPD. They systematically mapped out mosques, youth groups, even like kebab shops. spied on people, ordinary innocent people. They didn't generate a single terror lead doing this, but they did this in a very something like you would see in the Soviet Union. And I asked Democrats, shouldn't Bloomberg, he has his primetime speaking spot, shouldn't he at least apologize for that? I mean, it wasn't appropriate. Almost nobody would tell me that. I mean, virtually everybody I talked to, including people tied to Hillary Clinton, members of Congress, Julian Castro, they were just saying, no, it's fine. It's a big tent. Everyone was afraid to deal with this person because he's such a huge political force because of his wealth and also the fact that he owns a massive media network. He has all these controlled so much data through data services. And I think he spent something like $100 million in 2018 election. So a lot of down ballot Democrats or maybe state reps or state senators are looking like, should I come out against him, or is he gonna find my Republican opponent next time if I do that?
So this is an interesting point here. First off, I remember when the spying program took place, and I think it was the Associated Press, if I recall, was the one who broke it, and suddenly people were backtracking and trying to get away from this program that they were supporting. But I remember I was in Los Angeles for a fundraiser, and it was a bunch of female candidates that were running, but Kirsten Gillibrand was on at this fundraiser in a backyard of some wealthy person's house, and I asked the question. I said, Senator Gillibrand, you're such a great advocate for 9/11 first responders, and you've really made sure to keep 9/11 on the minds of Americans. Why is it that you've supported this Muslim spying program? And it was like a hush in the crowd. They shoved her, moved around on stage, and she didn't answer the question, of course, or she spun it to something else. But I think that indicates the fear that a sitting U.S. senator even had over questioning this program, which was by Michael Bloomberg. And that's crazy. Like, she's clearly above him in status at the time and wasn't willing to take a stand. But you mentioned something that I really want to discuss because it's in terms of the infrastructure, the data. What do you mean by Michael Bloomberg has data programming tools and software?
Well, it's funny. I know somebody who used to work for one of his companies for 5 years, and he told me that even he doesn't entirely understand it. So I'm probably not the best person to entirely explain it. But basically, Bloomberg has built his empire off of information, off of financial information, off of news information, off of both a television network and a website in print through Bloomberg and Businessweek. This is a man who operates at some level at a very empirical level. I think people always say that Bloomberg is someone who's data driven, and I think that to some extent he deserves a little bit of credit in terms of how he operates. And that I think when he entered the race in something like December, a lot of people were not taking him seriously. A lot of people were saying it's a vanity project. He's going to get 4 or 5%, whatever. Now he has topped Elizabeth Warren in many of the Super Tuesday states. He is in a solid third place in some of these states.
That's jarring. So, mapping out his strategy, he joined the race in December. He has a lot of longtime political establishment consultants who've been part of his team as the mayor, whether it's Howard Wolfson or others, and they're on his team again. And, they work with the establishment media. They prop up articles that kind of reinforce the narrative of centrist, cap kind of, the Clintonian Podesta world, right? But lately, in the last few months, it's been jarring to see how many staffers have been sucked up, whether it's from other presidential campaigns or just on the ground by Michael Bloomberg. So can you give us a sense of how big is that, and what does that effectively give him since he's doing this?
Yeah, so I think going into the Iowa caucus, where he chose not to compete, in these early states, partly because you have to do a lot of personal campaigning in those places. You've had to have been there for a year, and I think he just kind of figured he wasn't up for that. He didn't want to do that. But I think through the Iowa caucus, he had something like 1,000 staff, which is sizable. That has to be similar to what the other campaigns have, and Bloomberg's just been in this 2 months. And after the Iowa caucus, they announced that what they're planning on doing 2 things. One is doubling that staff to 2,000, which would make him the largest campaign by far. And 2 is doubling their ad spending. They've spent $270 million going through Iowa, and they want to double what they're going to be putting on the airwaves and going to Super Tuesday. So I think part of it is they saw Joe Biden's performance. I mean, of course, the Iowa results are kind of a mess. We don't know exactly what happened, but it looks like Biden is in fourth place. I think Bloomberg looks at that and he says, hey, I can get a lot of the same people. If you look at Morning Consult and they do waves of polling of the National Democratic electorate, I think something like maybe 20% or above 20% of Biden's people say their second choice already is Michael Bloomberg, and he's been in the race for 2 months and hasn't done much except for spend tons of money on ads, and he could spend 100 times more if he wanted. So I think Bloomberg is on to something here. He thinks that Biden will start to get pushed out by the Petes and the Bernies of the world, and that he can step up and say, hey, I'm the person who can stop Bernie. I'm the one who has the checkbook who can stop Bernie, because it looks like Biden probably doesn't even have enough money to go on the air in a serious way with negative attacks against Bernie if he wanted to. So I think that's what Bloomberg is trying to achieve here. He's trying to become the new kind of, I don't know if you call it the establishment lane. We call it the moderate lane, but it's hard to even ideologically peg Bloomberg in some ways, in that he is, for instance, really into climate issues, but he is also someone who endorsed Rudy Giuliani, John McCain, George W. Bush. He supported the Iraq War. He's compared Social Security to a Ponzi scheme. He's made no bones about how hostile he is to that, or how hostile he is to some unions like teachers' unions. So I think it's hard to peg him on a normal, traditional left-right basis. In some ways, he is kind of outside the two-party system, but he's definitely someone who's in kind of the high culture, cosmopolitan New York elite, in the sense that he tends to be more hostile, more friendly to liberal social issues, but much more hostile towards progressive and labor causes and working class causes.
I mean, that's
so
not
I think,
necessarily centrist. That sounds like frankly, a modern Republican who's not associated. I mean, even Donald Trump was friendly to those issues prior to having to win the evangelical vote of the Republican Party. I mean,
and I think that's what people should understand here, is that in some ways Bloomberg would be the most right-wing person who could win the Democratic primary, in the sense that he has a history of being party agnostic to how it suits him. I mean, he is somebody who supported Scott Brown, for instance, in the 2012 election against Elizabeth Warren. He was trying to eliminate Elizabeth Warren from being able to enter the U.S. Senate because he was very defensive of Wall Street and the banking sector. But, he's someone who will dump a bunch of money into the Democratic Party if he wants to get gun control measures passed. So I think one way to think about him is not so much him sitting somewhere on an ideological spectrum, so much as he's someone who has a very high regard for himself and his view of the world. And I think he admires people who are that way. I mean, he has at times defended the leader of China, saying the leader of China is not a dictator, a very unusual position to take for somebody who was not, for someone who wasn't elected, who can jail any of his political opponents at will, where dissent is illegal. But I think Bloomberg has a similar kind of mindset, in that he doesn't think very much of democracy. He doesn't think very much of deliberation, of Congress. One of his big criticisms of Obama was that Obama let Congress write the legislation. He thought Obama should have just written the legislation and forced Congress to pass it, which of course Obama could not have done, but Bloomberg maybe could do, given how much money he has. He could be his own lobbyist and spend hundreds of millions of dollars getting Congress to cut Social Security or whatever he needs to do. So I think that we should think of Bloomberg as somebody who wants to kind of run the U.S. federal government as his government. Above the traditional party system, above the traditional democratic processes. And in many ways, I think that may remind people of Donald Trump. But the thing about Donald Trump is he's not very effective at doing that.
Yeah.
He can't even manage his own staff. They keep quitting and backbiting,
he's a chaos
fighting
agent.
each other.
Donald Trump is a chaos agent, and Bloomberg has an agenda.
If you let's remember Bloomberg's electoral record. This is a guy who supported some of the most right-wing Republicans in America, but got elected to New York City 3 times, who convinced the city council to change the term limits to be elected a 3rd time. His 3rd time, he spent $183 per vote. That's how much money of his own money he put up. He is somebody who I think can very effectively bend the rules, as we saw with the DNC when they allowed him into debates recently. They had one set of rules the entire time going forward, which was to say, hey, you have to have a number of small donors to be in these debates or achieve certain polling thresholds. They eliminated that threshold, which will hurt candidates like Andrew Yang, who's built the grassroots movement, but will benefit people like Michael Bloomberg, who sat out the debates so far because he thought it wasn't in his interest to be held accountable. Now he wants to be in the debates because he's going to be there on Super Tuesday, and it gives him legitimacy. But of course, now that he's in the debates, he didn't have to go through the process of talking to people in Iowa, talking to people in New Hampshire, going through town halls, actually being held accountable, because I think his political style is above Democratic accountability. He believes very much that he is the smartest guy in the room, and he believes very much that he can buy his way into doing what's right. And I don't think it's necessarily all nefarious. I do think he has a sense of morality or justice he's following in doing this. But I think if you're someone who's concerned about having those open, liberal, transparent democratic processes, having someone like this in the race, I mean, it could go beyond a mere left versus right distinction. It's changing the American form of government and how our elections are supposed to work.
So, we're looking at how Bloomberg is buying up pretty much every pathway to victory he could have. And of course, as Biden weakens, as Bloomberg, or not, excuse me, as Pete Buttigieg, who does not have a path really moving forward because he lacks people of color, and pretty much all of the major states, the next 10 states, require some, support of people of color, maybe excluding New Hampshire. Bloomberg has really stayed away from populist states and focused on states where there are big media buys. And just to break this down for our audience, because the reason why presidential campaigns in particular, are so expensive, a big chunk of the budget, aside from field efforts, really comes down to making television ads. And there are different types of campaigns you can do, but Bloomberg has been able to boost his name ID outside of New York City because he's able to buy media ads. And one thing I just keep hearing from Democrats is, he's not going to get anywhere. Nobody likes him. I'm hearing that from New York Democrats. And first off, a lot of people in New York still like Michael Bloomberg. We are in a bubble. I live in Western Queens. It's the socialist mecca. But with that being said, a lot of people, Democrats included, still like Michael Bloomberg. They haven't gotten the memo on his record. But aside from that, you go to states like, I was in Arizona in the wintertime, and I had family members, who are fairly moderate, who are socially progressive now. I also have Republican family members who thought Michael Bloomberg would be a great option because they're watching his ads. They're reading he was a great mayor in New York, not this de Blasio. It's like, you don't live in New York, you don't know the deal. We've got criticisms of de Blasio, but let me tell you, he was a million times better than Bloomberg. So at the end of the day, you have this messaging apparatus that he has, whether it's to the financial people who probably don't like Trump for a lot of reasons, whether it's to the centrist Democrats or the anti-Bernie people. Can he build a coalition before the convention, I ask, as a potential candidate that could win the nomination on that coalition, essentially blocking Bernie from the nomination or coming in second? Could he build that coalition at this point?
It's difficult to say. I'm not 100% sure that he's somebody who could actually, given that he started at this point in the process, I'm not sure if he could actually win the nomination of the Democratic Party and be the Democratic Party's nominee. And I also don't know what would happen if he did do that. It may end up splitting the Democratic Party. But I do think that he has a much likelier chance of being in a kingmaker type position, where, let's say, somebody like Biden holds on through the race. He doesn't have quite enough delegates to win, but then Bloomberg says, hey, I have 10 or 15%. I can give them to you for X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And I think that's, to me right now, that is kind of the biggest challenge he poses to the Bernie Sanders movement, in that this is the only person in the race who really has enough money to go negative hard on Bernie Sanders if they needed to. Yeah. He's the only person who could put up $100 million of attack ads, and it's just no sweat. Biden really can't afford to do that. Pete can't afford to do that. And I think that position is really more of the challenge now, although I don't know if we want to underestimate him. I mean, I think one of my more politically aware friends was saying that when he was first running in the early 2000s in New York City, people said the same thing. People don't like him. He'll only have a base in Manhattan. He can't win. And then, from there to there. Let's talk about, one of the other advantages he has besides the television ads is that for the last few years, he has been running this kind of program for American mayors, where he gives them training, gives them trips. I think it's run through Harvard, but also through his philanthropy. And this has gotten him some pretty serious endorsements. He's gotten the mayor of San Francisco, the mayor of Washington, D.C., I believe the mayor of, I think it was Augusta or Macon, Georgia. But he's gotten tons and tons of mayors behind him. He's gotten Stephanie Murphy, the congresswoman out in Florida, behind him. And I think that, that is the kind of thing those are the kind of endorsements that could actually matter, because when you're sitting in one of these Super Tuesday states you're watching these ads. They're pretty inoffensive ads. They're just like, Trump is terrible, gun control is great.
Yeah.
Any Democrat will watch and be like, okay, that's fine. Like, you haven't really heard anything negative about this person. Oh, your local mayor just endorsed them. Like, it's actually not a terrible strategy. If you have those kind of resources at your disposal, it's not it's a pretty savvy way to go about it. And I think that, the real challenge is, would he actually be weighed down by some kind of negative strategy from one of the other candidates? Would a Sanders or a Biden or someone actually try to take him down a few notches? Because right now he's really not facing any criticism. He's just kind of skating out there doing this. And I'm not surprised that you're meeting friends and family who are just saying, I haven't really heard anything negative about this person. He just seems like he's got some good ideas and people are endorsing him. I see his ads all the time. Why not? Like, everyone else in this race has been attacked at some point, right? Everyone else in this race is kind of wounded from the process. He just got in and he's just there. So
and because he's skipping a pathway that like Pete Buttigieg, when Black Lives Matter went after Pete Buttigieg, that really got in the way of his path to victory, right? He could not win the nomination by not having any people of color supporting him, Pete Buttigieg. But for Bloomberg, even though this is a stop and frisk mayor, so one of the things that I find very interesting is what kinds of attacks need to go against Bloomberg to hurt him with his core support. And that, I mean, when you're pulling from the centrists, when you're pulling from the Biden land, when you're pulling from, low information Democratic primary voters, people who decide in the last few weeks and say, I saw his ads, he seems like a nice guy. When you're pulling from anti-Trumpers, when you're in states where you have more open primaries and maybe a Republican or an independent can vote, and they're thinking we want to defeat Trump, so we're going to be Democrats this time around. Suddenly, that's the kind of stuff that pulls away from Bernie. But what are the attacks that affect those people? And my guess is, negative press is negative press. So of course it's going to affect him in some way. So of course, if Black Lives Matter organized against Bloomberg, that would not be great for Bloomberg. But to really break into his support, it needs to be a kind of attack that hits those Wall Street types that could go either way, or I don't know. I mean, you've been looking at this.
What's interesting is so former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie was on some Sunday show, and he said something like, Bloomberg is out there. One way they could respond is by showing video of him endorsing Rudy Giuliani, John McCain, George W. Bush. I think the reality that Bloomberg has taken stances that really are outside the Democratic Party norm. I mean, even outside the centrist Democratic Party norm, like they were not campaigning for John McCain or George W. Bush, right? I think a lot of that probably will be reintroduced. I think that in terms of the stop and frisk issues, I mean, it's difficult because I think that's a New York City specific topic to some extent. It's kind of hard to explain to other people. I feel like you'd have to use ads maybe featuring people who were subjected to that and kind of explaining it a little bit. Just because I just think it's very, very local to New York, so it's kind of hard to tell other people how it works. There's a lot of video of Bloomberg being disparaging about Social Security, which I think is always a third rail issue. Certainly was used against Biden quite a bit, maybe to some great effect. I think that would be utilized. I think the fact that Bloomberg supported the Iraq War and spoke very favorably about that would be utilized. But I think, honestly, dealing with someone like Bloomberg really is a matter of exposing the fact that this guy has an autocratic mindset and that he buys people off and buys everything. And the idea is, do you want to live in a country where this person can dictate every aspect of our government through his money and of your lives? I mean, he's done a lot of weird kind of nanny state stuff that's kind of unusual, whether it's going after big gulp sodas or
that's when the
vaping.
Republicans turned on him. That's when they turned on him. It was Fox News would do whole segments on, let me drink my big gulp. Let's, he wanted to, the bike lanes became controversial in New York. He wanted to build parks instead of walkways. I mean, this is stuff that, that little stuff bothers people. It's like when you go to a restaurant you've been going to every day for, the last 15 years, and suddenly your meal's smaller and they're charging you for an extra side of dressing. That stuff drives you nuts.
And here's another thing. I just saw a poll out from the Michigan AFT which is the American Federation of Teachers Union. They have done internal surveys of their membership. And I think Bernie was leading their membership with 25, 26%. Bloomberg's pretty far down there. I mean, 6 or 7%. But Bloomberg is one of the people who is most responsible for the spread of charter schools and high-stakes testing in the United States. He spends tons and tons of money on pro-charter school referendums, pro kind of privatization, high-stakes testing type stuff. There are a lot of teachers in the Democratic constituency, and they vote. I think that
can we touch
this is
on
big.
why though? Because this is I think key. It's not that he has some sort of like, passion for reforming and quote unquote the education process in New York City, not in all states, because charter schools the laws are different in every state. In New York City is directly tied to hedge fund management and real estate holdings, and so that's I think something that we have to keep in mind is Bloomberg is not doing this because he feels passionate about an issue, including gun reform, probably. I don't think, I disagree with you. I don't think he has an ideological background. Aside from all of this, we're talking about effective messaging. There is the undeniable message that Bloomberg is very similar to Donald Trump. He's like a Donald Trump light. And I feel like that might be a really good message for folks who want to dispel the power. It's going to be hard because he has such a massive operation, including comms, not to mention his own publication. But aside from that, this is somebody who I can speak from my own experience in running for office in New York City. During Bloomberg's time, you saw the income inequality grow at such a drastic rate. People were being pushed out of their neighborhoods, partly because there were these real estate deals where there were sweetheart deals, tax incentives for big developers, but the big developers were selling a good chunk of their real estate to foreign oligarchs who were using real estate in New York as cash placements. And so when you look at Michael Bloomberg, he had an opportunity to fight against this and he defended it. And it's just so ironic to me because, the same Democrats who complain about the oligarchs backing Donald Trump, they need to be aware that Michael Bloomberg was a partner in that deal. He was, working hand in hand with these folks.
Michael Bloomberg is 50 times richer than Donald Trump. That's the other thing people need to understand. Like, when we talk about the idea that Trump being in the presidency is problematic because he's rich and he has connections everywhere, Bloomberg is a much bigger example of that. Bloomberg has, doesn't he have like a house in the Caribbean that's like a tax, his house is like a tax shelter or something like that.
He used to go there every weekend while he was mayor of New York. For those of you who don't live in New York or don't remember, while he was mayor of New York, he would get on a private jet every weekend and go to the Caribbean to his house. You cannot make this stuff up. And so this is a guy who wants to run for president. I think the big question here is, does he really want the presidency or does he not? I don't, do you know? Do we have a sense?
It's hard. It's really hard to know whether he's just there to block someone like Sanders. Earlier, it was common wisdom that he had expected Biden to do better and that Biden would be serving the person to serve to block Sanders or Warren. Now it appears that Biden is faltering so much that Bloomberg may have ramped everything up, thinking that he's the only guy who can do this. I think when you're someone like Bloomberg and you've created this kind of wealth over your life, you became mayor, you've bent the rules, people all over the world, foreign leaders feed you. I think at that level, you get some kind of an ego, right? So it may be that Bloomberg actually thinks he can actually win the race and reorient the Democratic Party towards his philosophy, changing it into a more consummate kind of cosmopolitan neoliberal party. And I think, you have to remember, this is someone who's also been supporting all those groups trying to strike a quote-unquote grand bargain, which means cutting back on Social Security and Medicare, increasing some taxes, closing some loopholes to tackle deficits, so on and so forth. He was never able to achieve that. And part of the reason he wasn't able to achieve that is because usually a faction of the Democrats and a faction of the Republicans don't want to go along with that. But if you're president and you can personally spend your money lobbying and on campaign money, he could probably achieve something like that. And I don't think Joe Biden would have as easy of a time doing something like that, even if he were to rebound and become the president. So I think there's many reasons for Bloomberg to think that if he was president, he could achieve a lot of the goals he's been trying to advocate for from the outside. But it's much more powerful when you have that amount of money and you have the most powerful government office in the world. So,
I think something that I find fascinating as somebody who's really interested in the financial backing of the Democratic Party is how Bloomberg is kind of a money saver for a lot of these worn out billionaire donors who've been funding campaigns. I mean, in 2016, of course, you know, $1 billion was blown up. The DNC is in a deficit. There's a lot of like pet projects that organizations probably are still hitting up these donors for. But by not having to put money into a presidential campaign, it frees up a lot of that billionaire donor class money for these like side grifting organizations, because let's just call it what they are. They're not known for winning elections. They're known for being employment programs. I mean, the best example, of course, most recent example is from the Iowa caucuses, this app, which was surrounded by an ecosystem of organizations kind of moving money around.